I'm Microsoft teaming with Microsoft Teams. I'm learning and dreaming with Microsoft Teams. The hub and the teamwork of Microsoft 365 in these quarantine times. I'm Microsoft teaming with Microsoft Teams. Yeah, with Microsoft Teams.
Hey everybody, thanks for joining. My name is Stephen Rose. Welcome to Inside Microsoft Teams. This is episode 2. For those joining us live today, please put your questions into the chat. We're excited to hear what you have to say and we'll answer them during the show. And for those of you watching on demand, thanks for tuning in. We appreciate it. As part of my role, I get to talk to customers a lot, which is great. And the one thing that I hear again and again is we've deployed Teams, but they're just using it for chat and for meetings. How do we get them to use it as a collaborative platform? Doing and making company-wide adoption is hard. And as a matter of fact, for the first time in our modern era, it's even harder because we have 4 generations of users in the workplace. We have baby boomers, folks born from 1946 to 1964, making up 4% of our workforce. Then we have Gen X, 65 to 80, making up just about 40%, millennials making another 40%, and Gen Z entering the workforce at 18%. But what does that really mean? Well, what that means is for the boomers, they started using computers when it was a big desktop unit and a small monitor and are used to having everything on that device and logging in and all their files are there or maybe in an X drive, but everything is on that device. For Gen X, we moved to laptops, so we got a little more familiar, a little more comfortable with kind of moving things back and forth and starting to leverage the cloud as a platform, but still very much about on-the-metal software. Now, millennials, they were born in the cloud. They got used to things like Office Online and, Google Docs and all of that. They're used to working off of a tablet or an iPad or a laptop or whatever they want. And they're also used to being able to get their data from anywhere. They're comfortable working on a PC that has nothing but a browser on it, unlike our boomers and Gen X. And Gen Z, well, they don't see the difference between a cell phone and a PC. It's just a way to get to your stuff in the cloud. And understanding this, that, if you want to retain your most talented workers, your millennials and Gen Z, you need to allow them to work anywhere from any device and do it securely. But understanding the way that they like to work is so incredibly important for those folks who are going to be supporting them. Last year, 2 out of every 3 software deployments failed to garner the expected usage or just failed all out. That's $50 billion worth of wasted money. So how do we fix this? How do we get people to actually use the software that you deploy? Well, to help us answer this, I'm joined by Brian Hash, who is a change management expert. He works for Cargil. They've been around since 1865. It's the largest privately held corporation in the U.S. 166,000 users. Welcome, Brian. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. How are you doing?
I am doing great. Take a moment and tell folks how we met, because it's a bit of an interesting story.
Yeah, so I'm seated in human resources, and we were interested in structured learning and development. So how do we upskill ourselves and become more of a consultancy within the organization? And so, I have a background in psychology, and like any psychologist, I'm interested in metrics. So I went out to my constituents and said, what do you want to learn about? And by far, one of the things that people were most interested in was learning how to leverage digital technology, including Teams, which is a big deal at Cargill. And so I said, well, let me go out and find out who's the expert on getting the most out of Teams. And I came across you in the Microsoft community. And I reached out and we got to know each other a little bit. And you joined us as a guest speaker on one of we called a Lunch and Learn series. And and it helped to elevate our team a lot. So we learned a bunch of new tips and tricks and best practices that we had not heard before. So it was really good.
Yeah, no, you found me on Twitter, which was great. He's like, hey, I'm looking for someone who could come in and teach a class, and what do you have? And I'm like, I'll do it. And he's like, really? And I'm like, sure, why not? And that was where it's at. So if you don't think that I'm actually following you when you ask me something on Twitter, I really am listening. So, and that was an awesome experience, and I got to know your end users and heard some great stuff, and that's what started this whole thing. Now you came on as a contractor back in 2019 as a change management expert, and Then Kate went on as a full-time employee, but you were saying that during COVID, Teams was available, but it was, the use was good, but not great. And you sort of took a step back from that and your Salesforce rollout to this DCA, drive change approach. And what is that? What does that mean? And what does that mean to you?
Well, the DCA, the driving change approach is just a methodology. It's a way to manage and measure behavior with a specific change in mind, whether it was Salesforce or Teams or even a culture change. So it's just a structured way of bringing people along the journey. But you're right. Teams has been around in Cargil for a bit of time now, but admittedly, like other organizations, maturity and adoption vary across the organization. Some teams, like my own, use it, fully and extensively. Others use it just for the chat functionality. Right. So even within an organization like that, ours, you see pockets of adoption that are higher or lower.
When we think about change, we kind of either look at it as a top-down approach or a bottom-up. Which did you do at Cargil and why? Is this, I got to get all my leadership on board, or if people at the bottom don't say, hey, we want Teams and start to use it, and then work my way up? So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think when it comes to deciding whether or not a top-down or bottoms-up approach is going to work best, I think it depends on how obvious the benefits of the change are. So, and I'll just use a silly example and a serious example. If you were implementing Taco Tuesday, the benefit of that change is self-evident. Everyone understands what they're going to get out of it, and so you don't even need to push it. You will just benefit from a bottoms-up experience. If you're implementing a new technology that might have a high learning curve or a steep learning curve, then you might need to do a tops-down approach because the value of the change may not be as obvious to the end user. Now, with Microsoft Teams, the value proposition of using it, I would say, was obvious enough to get early adoption, sort of like a shallow layer of adoption, but people probably weren't using as many of the features that were available to them without a tops-down approach. So With respect to Teams specifically, I would say you probably need to do both. There's enough innate value of using Teams that you will benefit from organic bottoms-up change adoption. But if you want to maximize its benefit for the organization, then you probably have to have leaders at the top aligned to the vision and articulating that information through the organization.
Now, one of the most important things to do is before you roll this out, and you and I were chatting about this earlier, is, in preparing users of the why and what and when of change, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But the stage that a lot of people forget is to get a baseline. Talk about what that means.
Well, I think you have to understand that you're implementing a change, whether it's a digital technology, whether you're trying to change the culture, whether you're implementing Taco Tuesday, you're doing it for a specific reason. And I think establishing a baseline, it gives you some sort of a metric so that later on you will have objective evidence that you made progress, that the change that you made satisfied whatever your business need was, whatever the business case was. And so when we talk about establishing a baseline, the future state will be your vision for the future. It's what you're going to align to. The baseline is basically taking stock of where you're at today. So
and
if
how do you do that?
Well, there's a lot of different ways you can do it. The easiest way is just through a baseline survey. So, for example, maybe the reason you're implementing Teams is because you want people to have fewer places to store all their information. So you could start with a baseline survey that simply says, hey, Stephen, how many tools approximately do you use to store all your critical work files? And in the beginning, you'd expect that number to be bigger. And then as the change, assuming Teams consolidates where you store all your files, then over time, you'd expect that number to decrease to basically just one, right? Teams is your source of truth. So That's what a baseline means. It's just trying to get a sense of where you're at today relative to the future you envision.
Got it. One of the things that I heard a lot from customers when I talk to them about that is, we'll often say, how many steps does it take to get to your data? And they would go, well, I have to, first of all, get to my PC, and I have to log in via VPN. Then I have to go to the X drive, and then I have to do this. And we're like, that's a lot of steps. And especially for management, convincing leaders is, here's the cost that we're spending for this. Instead of, I can just go to my phone. If you text me on a Friday night and say, hey, I have a huge presentation tomorrow, can you send this to me? I can go to my phone, go to Teams, and just share that with you. And you have it in seconds. And I don't need to sit and go through all that and all that extra money that's spent. So it's about that why, when, want, and capability. And kind of take a moment on that, because I thought it was really unique, your sort of view on that.
Yeah, so I like to think about an outcome-based approach to stakeholder management, right? So the people that are invested in whatever change we're making, so we're going to implement teams, for example, they are stakeholders. And I very much believe in an outcome-based approach to managing them along the journey. And I call it get it, want it, capable of doing it. And I get that from a book that I'll reference later. But basically, it's you break it down into three parts. Regardless of the stakeholder, what type of stakeholder they are, the first thing I want to know is, do they get it? Do they understand what we're changing, why we're implementing it, when we're going to implement it, what we expect from them, how is it going to affect them, and where they can find additional information? If you can have them answer those questions, then pat yourself on the back. They get it. They understand what's happening. Number two is, do they want it? And again, it depends on the complexity of the change. There's a lot of environmental factors to consider, but you don't want to have open resistance or active resistance to the initiative.
Right.
So you want people to, for the most part, just be aligned or at least in agreement that they're willing to adopt the change. And then the last one, the one that seems to be overlooked often, is capability, meaning does the person have the knowledge, skills, and abilities to use Teams or whatever technology effectively, and or did you give them the bandwidth to learn how to do it effectively?
Right.
So a lot of change initiatives fail. You talked about the two-thirds in the beginning. A lot of the reason that those changes fail is because the employees simply were incapable of succeeding. They didn't have the training, they didn't have the skills and the bandwidth to acquire said skills.
Right. And it's also important that when you're looking at your user base, that you understand that 15% of your users are early adopters. They're going to, whatever you throw at them, they're going to do, they're going to test it, they're going to play with it, they're going to love it. And another 15% are going, never, you can't make me, not going to happen, which puts about 70% of your users in the center. And that's where you want to focus. The folks, that 15% who are resistant to change, you could spend a ton of time and money on those folks and nothing will change. The only thing is when 85% of the users are doing this, then they can't get their work done, and then they're forced to sort of move into that and often see that their resistance was futile. But it's looking at that. I just did a Borg quote. Resistance is futile, but it's that 70%. So what are some of the best practices that you've done to help move some of those 70% over from the, questionable beige area into the green?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one of the most important things is you actually have to have effective leadership, executive sponsors who are driving the initiative. When we think about what is it that motivates an employee to do something, to change anything, knowing that human beings are hardwired to prefer homeostasis, right? I'm not going to change out of the goodness of my heart unless I'm in that 15% of, the early adopters you described.
Right.
The 70% are likely going to stay as steady as they can. So what changes their behavior? We know that about 15% of their behavior is motivated by what they hear their leaders say. So Steven's the manager, and he says, Brian, Teams is really important. You should use it. Okay, that's pretty motivating.
Mm-hmm.
We know that about 30% comes from what Steven does. So if Steven video calls me spontaneously on Microsoft Teams, I didn't expect that, but I saw him do it. Or if he starts storing in critical files on Teams, I saw him do that. And then the remaining, 55% or so comes from what the leader reinforces. So does Steven, publicly give me praise because I managed all my files in Teams, or because I used Kudos feature, or whatever it is. And similarly, holding me accountable in private for not doing the right things, or exhibiting the desirable behaviors. So say, do, and reinforce is one of the most critical things you can do to move that big block in the middle over to adoption.
Leading by example. And I, this is thing we've heard is, we once we got our bosses to turn on their cameras and say, hi, can you please turn on your cameras? Everybody did it. But if they're not doing it, no one else will. Exactly. What about at what point do you start to remove those old apps? Because those become crutches for folks where this is what I know and I'm going to keep using it. One of the things I heard one company say is, well, we're going to, re-roll out the old apps and put them in virtual environments and get the new ones and tell people to start to use that, or vice versa, so that they can start to use both at the same time before we take that old one. So how do you look at that, and how do you sort of advertise that to folks that this is going to happen?
Yeah, it's such a tricky thing, especially at a company like Cargil. I mean, we work in 70 countries, and we found some pretty profound regional differences in terms of how you interact directly with a customer might be different. So maybe in one country, it's very appropriate to use what we in North America might consider outdated technology. So
Right.
it is tricky because you have to meet the needs of the business and meet the realities of their environment. So I think that I've seen a couple of different approaches. I've seen some organizations just take a hard and fast rule and say, okay, by December 31st, you have that much time to get onto the new platform because come January 1st, we're going to retire everything else.
Right.
That works. That those companies can happily report 100% adoption, but that does cause some turbulence and some stress and anxiety among employees. So if you're willing to cope with that, then okay.
Yeah.
Others, just you draw a line in the sand. You have some sort of a benchmark that says, okay, once we reach 80% adoption or we get 70% of the population using the new features, then we're gonna retire the old system. We recently went through something like that on my team, but what the exact threshold was, I'm not totally sure. I think it just depends on business needs, the environment, maturity, readiness, all those factors.
That makes sense. So I think one other thing that's important to this, and I'm actually going to share a slide on this, is understanding what users go through when you say, we're going to make a change. So this is what we call the change curve, but I like doing it a little more interestingly. I personally like to do the cage curve. So let's see. So first we have shock. I cannot believe it. We're going to make a change. Then there's denial. It will never work here. There is then frustration. It is all management's fault. Depression. I give up. Change is happening whether I like it or not. The experimentation, well, maybe we could make it work. The decision making, okay, let's move forward. And finally, we've made the change integration. Let's get back to business. And no one could walk us through this like Nicolas Cage can. All right, so all kidding aside, and I love Nick Cage, but what are some of the steps to manage this? I mean, we can look at, do you have, change champions? So let's kind of talk about super users and your sponsored training, and of course, building a CMS or productivity library. So let's delve into that. How do you give them the tools that they need so that when they get to that point, they're good and ready to move forward?
Yeah, I think that there's three approaches that I have taken that work pretty well in any type of technology or implementation. So I do think you mentioned super users, sometimes called change champions. I've even heard them just referred to as subject matter experts. And and what I've learned through my experience is that you're looking for a ratio of about 25 end users to every one champion, SME, what have you. And the reason for that ratio is because not all 25 people are going to come to me, the subject matter expert, every single hour of every single day, but they're going to come to me frequently enough that I could probably only support 25 at a time,
right? Especially
at the initial outset of the implementation. But as the implementation matures and evolves and progresses and more people move from that 70% over to the other side of the bell curve, then I can take on more than 25 and your ratio increases from 25 to maybe even 1,000 to 1, meaning you just need fewer super users over time.
Right. But it's also important to have super users that represent the different parts of the business so that somebody doesn't go, well, yeah, of course, Brian's going to say that. He doesn't do my job. He doesn't understand my job. So having somebody from that department saying, yes, you can, and here's how we're going to do it, can make a huge difference with that. So I think that's also part of that equation.
Yeah, you do have to have a representative sample of the business, right? Just like you have to have any representative sample of the populace. So you want to make sure you've got your regions, your businesses, your functions, all that has to be covered at some level. I should also point out that standing up a group of super users isn't as easy as it sounds. A lot of people will be voluntold, Stephen, you will be a super user.
Right.
And that's not a great experience. So we did some of the best implementations I've done started with a recruiting blitz where I would go out and figure out, okay, how many people understand what the technology is? Do they like to use it? Are they really, really strong at it? And then would they be willing to participate in a super user network? The network, aside from being frontline support, it also enabled two-way communication so that as a program lead, as a change practitioner, we had a way to articulate important features and announcements out to end users. But then because we had a representative sample of super users, we could hear from the businesses, the regions, and the functions about what teams' experiences or technology experiences that they were struggling with. And so it enabled that two-way communication in a very scalable way. So I can't emphasize enough the importance of super users.
Got it.
Live training sessions is a good old-fashioned way to do it. So this is just scheduling sessions over Teams or whichever platform makes sense, and just giving people a chance to see how to use the tool and what the features are capable of.
Mm-hmm.
And then lastly, you talked a little bit about self-paced learning. And again,
Yeah.
I think that's a very sensible approach. Bonus points if you have one that can track progress over time, so you can give folks a nudge when appropriate. But those three things together will really help people cultivate the knowledge, skills, and abilities they need to use Teams and other technology very quickly.
And I'll give some links in a little bit, because we do have a CMS template for SharePoint that you can download to create your training and track all that. And we'll get to all those great resources and the books that Brian's talking about in a few minutes. But hindsight, what would you do differently? Knowing what you know now and how things turned out, what would you do differently?
There is a really good saying in one of the books I'm reading right now that no battle plan survives contact with the enemy. And one of the things I learned about change management is that no detailed change management plan survives contact with stakeholders. They're going to behave in ways that you didn't experience or that you didn't expect. They're going to do things that you did not anticipate. And so looking back on it, I sat down with the best of intentions on some of that work. And just within the first maybe 30 days, all of the change plan got blown up, and I had to just learn how to improvise a little bit. So that'd be one thing I would recommend, is just thinking more about the leader's intent, the change practitioner's intent, and focus less on detailed, nuanced change plans. They won't make as much of a difference as people would like to believe.
Okay.
A second one is, I think honest value propositions are really important. So we talked about get it and want it and capable of doing it. If I want to make Stephen capable or aware that something's happening, and I want to increase his level of desire for the change, the worst thing I could do is give a dishonest value proposition in my comms, right? Adding a bunch of fluff pieces and making it seem like it's going to solve all the world's problems, and it's minimal burden on Stephen. It's called a breach of psychological contract, and it's like poison in the well. He's never going to want to work with me again. And looking back on it, that was a problem we had in some of our past implementations, not specific to Teams, but other technologies, where the value propositions were misleading at best. And so that'd be one thing, is just being brutally honest about what is the value both for the individual and the organization, and what is the investment that you're expecting that person to make. Another one that I would say, I guess the last one I'd leave you with, is just thinking about the metrics. So we talked about this a little bit at the beginning, but you're not making this implementation for the sake of doing so.
Right.
And so adoption metrics are important, right? How many users are logging in and how many times are they clicking on the features? That's all important. But I would also think about, what is the business case? What is the specific pain point that you're trying to solve for? What's the specific opportunity you're trying to take advantage of? And just make it more than just adoption. So looking back on some of my own projects, that'd be one thing I wish we had pushed a little harder for, was not just adoption metrics, but if we're trying to reduce the number of clicks or the amount of time spent in meetings, or the amount of computing power we need, whatever that business case is, I would want to make sure that the metrics reflect that.
Yeah, it's super important to understand the individual's daily pain. And that's also another thing, and we talked about this earlier, which is, hi, how many times have you had to do this? Or, again, that example of, here you are, you took an afternoon off, somebody desperately needs something where you had to run home, or you had to get it to them late at night, instead of just being able to go to your phone and go get that. Or somebody had a quick question and they didn't want to call, by pinging you on Teams and you checking it once a day and being able to get back to them and not have 20 emails going back and forth, you've reduced that. So understanding what those individual pains are and saying, here's how we're going to solve what you have told me are some of the biggest pains that you have each day, or not being able to move between devices because what you need is on one and not on the other. So understanding how people do their jobs as part of that business readiness assessment is so important, but also understanding where the individual pains are and how this will solve it can make it personal for folks. And that's so incredibly important.
Absolutely.
I have one more question that I want to talk about resources, but is there a good standard change methodology approach, or is every project different?
It's both. Every project is a little different.
You can't say it's both. I'm just kidding.
Fair enough. So there's a lot of outstanding methodologies on the market, but the truth is I've taken some of the most common ones, and I like to nerd out. I like to geek out on all things change. And when you stack up all the different change methodologies side by side, what you learn is that they generally seem to flow the same way. Like, you got to get the leaders on board. You've got to assess the current state. You need to activate the change, right? Flip the switch, turn it on, whatever it is. You need to drive adoption, and then you need to sustain the effort over the long haul.
Right.
Generally speaking, that's how they all kind of go. And but some of the ones that I thought have been really well done, I think ProSci has a good approach called AdCard. That's very strong. Pioneer Management has their adaptive change framework, which is another really good one. Here at Cargil, we talked about the DCA, and even my own. I have my own approach that I think works really well. So there's a lot of different approaches, but those kind of 5 broad steps I talked about at the beginning, you can usually bundle any change under those 5 phases of work and see good progress towards your end goal.
Awesome. And I think one other thing, and this was my first week at business school, which is projects have a start date or an end date. You can't have both. So you're going to say, hi, if we're going to start this July 1st, then you do your project plan. You say, and we'll finish February of the next year. Or if we want to be done by January, then here's the work back plan and when we need to start.
Absolutely.
But don't say we're going to start this in July and end this in December without doing that plan. Don't pick both. What are some of your favorite resources? Because we're going to put these up on the screen, but what do you really love, and where do folks start that want to do this on their own?
That is a good question. I think that I'll make some recommended readings that I think are really good. HBR actually has a good book called 10 Must-Reads on Change Management, and it's a good way to get a breadth of knowledge without going too deep into one area by a very reputable source. So that'd be a great starting point. One book by Simon Sinek that I really like is called Start With Why, and it gets into what you and I talked about earlier, right? It's the value. What's in it for me? Why are we doing any of this?
Right.
What's the pain point we're trying to solve? So that's just a deep dive on that particular topic. Switch is a really good book. It gives you these various scenarios for how to make change happen when change is hard. One of the great examples in that book was a story about a guy and his team went to Vietnam with basically no budget, no support, and figured out how to solve malnutrition in rural Vietnam. And it was a really inspiring story, but he shows you how you use some basic change management techniques to
Right.
implement change in a difficult environment. Reinventing Organizations looks at the role of human consciousness in organizations by Frederick Laloux. It's a very illuminating. It basically challenges the way that we think about the world, and can today's way of thinking solve the problems of tomorrow? Spoiler alert, the answer is no. Made to Stick is another really good one. So this is about how do you make your ideas really sticky. They use a great example of the urban legend of people messing with your kids' Halloween candy when there's literally no evidence that that's ever happened ever. But why does that idea stick with us so well? Why do we believe that that's a thing? We worry about that as parents. So it explores topics like that so that you can figure out how to make your own ideas very sticky, which is important in communications, which is a big piece of what we're talking about today.
Which one would you recommend to someone that is a beginner, brand new to this? I kind of want to start from the beginning because you're listing a lot, and that's awesome. And we're going to put them all up on the screen. But what is a good one for somebody going, I'm just starting this? So what's that best first book?
If I would go with just one, I'd probably start with Switch.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. And what was the last one that you were going to mention? I do want you to mention.
And the last one, you could make an argument for or against including this one. I like Traction by Gino Wickman. It's a really good one about how to treat your business like an operating system. And just like any device, you can only have one operating system. You can't have a whole bunch working, not if you want to be effective. And so I just like the simplicity and pragmatism of the approach.
I've read that one as well, and I agree 100%. Some resources that I recommend, certainly start at our adoption.microsoft.com page. We've got tons of great information, including how to become a champion and leading your own Change Champions program. The productivity library, it links to that with all those great short snackable size videos, an overview of the Microsoft 365 learning pathways, which is how you set up that really cool learning portal. Of course, there's some really good blogs. One of my favorites, The 5 Steps for Boosting Your Digital Transformation. And Viva Learning is a really great thing to add and how that's going to help folks. Brian, this was awesome. One last piece of advice for our guests that you would like to share with them.
You can't manage what you don't measure, so make sure that you focus on the quantitative measurement of behavior. If you want to make change happen, you've got to have some sort of measures, metrics, and KPIs in place.
Awesome. Absolutely love it. Thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it. I hope that this episode on change management is helping you to think a little bit more about that step. Matter of fact, if you take a look at the team's landing page on Docs, you'll notice after pilot, it's adopt. it comes before you deploy. And if you haven't done it then, that's fine, but go back, really think about it, how to drive users and make that your metric or KPI for your next fiscal year. Again, Brian, thanks so much for joining us. Our next episode, we will be featuring tips and trick videos from some of our team's MVPs. They're going to share what their favorite admin tricks and end user and really cool stuff. You absolutely do not want to miss this. We will see you next time on Inside Microsoft Teams. Look, I'm playing with poop. I'm playing with poop. What? I'm sorry. Poop.